Hello everybody, welcome back to another Pandora Hearts discussion video. This time I'm going to be tearing open volume number 19. Now if you're new to this series, this is the 19th video, I can't believe you guys are new to the series, but hey, if you are, there are spoilers. This video is nothing but spoilers for volume number 19 and anything that happened before it. The other rule of these videos is I always record them before I have read ahead. So even though all the volumes are available, I haven't read ahead, so I have no idea what happens beyond this volume. Anything that I question and wonder about, well, it's really because I just don't know. So let's get right into volume number 19, because this one answered one of my biggest questions that I've been asking, especially over the last two volumes, where we found out the origins of Jack, well, sort of like the backstory of Jack Vesalius, Lacey, Alice, even the reality of the being that we know as Oz. So this one, I questioned in that one. I was like, okay, so how does it happen that a chain can become a baby and be grown and grow up and everything else? And how does that happen? So we have our answer. But let's kind of break it down as we go. So the book opens up with a sort of a flashback of Oz remembering the night that he and Gil, and I guess this is shortly after Gil has joined the household and is now Oz's new valet, shows them as they are going through the house, and sort of Oz decides to drag Gil on this bit of an adventure, and he steals Oscar's camera. Now, we remember from previous volume just how significant this camera was to Oscar. And when he finds Oz and Gil, he slaps Oz across the face. And this is to Oz, he says, this is the first time that I remember Oscar actually looking angry. And this is the first time that he was angry at me. And he wakes up, and of course it's been a dream, and he's now been imprisoned in Pandora by the Baskervilles. Now, it's really significant, this sort of opening, okay? Because this sets up the beginning of Oz and Gil's relationship, where Gil, of course, is referring to Oz as master, and Oz says at first he really liked it because it made him feel grown up and it made him feel like he was really developing, but that the more that he heard it, that he found it really irritating. And so he says to Gil, just call me Oz. And Gil tries so hard to try and just call him Oz, and eventually young Master Oz is what he ends up. And Oz says to him, that's fine for now. If that's the best you can do, we'll work on it. But one day when we are adults, you are going to be calling me Oz. And when I first read this, I kind of wondered what was more significant in this, that conversation with Oz and Gil, or whether the whole thing about Oscar and the way that Oscar treated Oz for his childhood and his formative years, and then this whole thing about how this camera was the first time that he sees Oscar angry. Now, I think a lot of this is going to revolve around future ideas that we get into in this volume, and definitely I think are going to be hit on in the volumes beyond. But there's two things going on here as far as I'm concerned. Oscar, the camera is Oscar's whole idea of family, right? It's all that emotion and that sense of loss and grief, as well as hope, that he has wrapped up in this single item. And that's why, of course, he explodes at Oz. And it's significant that we know, having seen beforehand, that Oscar brought the camera out when, just when he had sort of everybody together. You can see where Oscar was at that point and just see how much he's developed and how much he has grown to see Oz and Ada and Gil as his sort of surrogate children. And you see that true warmth and emotion that he has, because now we see that the camera being treated that way was the first time Oscar was angry, and yet Oscar most recently has been willing to finally use it. So now, and then of course we have the conversation with Oz and Gil, and it creates a beautiful bookend to the end of this volume, but we'll get there. So Oz is now a prisoner of Pandora, which has been taken over by the Baskervilles. Basically, they've taken advantage of the fact that the Dukes were away. Well, they're not just away. We know that House Night Ray, he's dead. well, Bit and Light Ray's almost basically all wiped out. We know that Rainsworth, Duchess Rainsworth, of course, not dead, but very critically injured by Duke Barma's betrayal. Duke Barma, of course, is aligned with the Baskervilles, and so is Duke Vesalius. Well, Oscar, I guess, is actually technically the Duke, but you can see where we find out that Oscar, basically the reason he hasn't been at Pandora is that he's trying to get Ada away. He's trying to protect her before he makes a move against Pandora. So now we find out how it is that you can have a child, an infant, be a chain. And this, this brings up so many questions to me. We find out the reality of Jack Vesalius. We find out how it is that Alice, black-haired Alice, became associated with the bee rabbit. All of this kind of happens because of the tragedy of Sablier, obviously. Now, we have Alice, of course, killing herself to sever the link between Jack and the intention of the Abyss. When Alice dies, she finds herself back in the Abyss it's just drawn as a blank room with two sofas that face back to back. And in the one sofa, of course, is black-haired Alice. And in the other one is the white-haired Alice, the intention of the Abyss. Now, the intention of the Abyss shows quite a bit of sort of love for Alice. And she's like, it's been so long since you've been here. You found your way back. So it seems to be like, I'm kind of wondering if this is sort of the area of the Abyss that the core of the Abyss prepared for these two sisters to be able to spend time. And I don't know if it's kind of like a thing where black-haired Alice living in the real world, if she was able to sort of psychically go back there, or whether she means physically. Like, they don't quite really say that. They just sort of say, you found your way back. And so we have the two of them conversing, and we find out that really the intention of the Abyss is messed up. Like, she is a psychological basket case. She talks about how she loses herself. She talks about how she finds herself drawn into things that she doesn't want to do, and that she can't remember things. And like, essentially what we're kind of finding out is we have one part of the intention of the Abyss that seems to care deeply for dark-haired Alice and sees her as a sister. There is that sisterly bond between them. But then there's this other part of the intention of the Abyss that has sort of this obsession with Jack, and basically is willing to disregard a lot of her own ideals and everything else when Jack is involved. Now, I don't know if this is sort of to be kind of like a metaphor, that whole thing, like love makes you crazy, or I don't know if perhaps we're talking about some kind of connection to Lacey, that perhaps because of, we know that the intention was able to retain that memory of Lacey that she then passed through Oz. I don't know if maybe there's a part of her that's somehow kind of tied into Lacey, and it's that element of Lacey that has the attachment to Jack, like almost as if the intention herself is like a split personality, has multiple personalities. And we know to a certain extent this is true because the core of the Abyss can assert itself to basically take control. We've seen that in the previous volume, and we see that in this volume as well, where the intention basically says to Alice, she's like, we need to find a way to prevent me from giving in to Jack, because as long as I remember all these things, as long as I keep retaining these feelings for Jack and everything else, I am going to keep going. I'm going to cause more problems. I have all of this sort of, chaos going on, and it's going to continue to be an issue. She's like, I need for those memories to be purged, basically. And so the two of them kind of decide that they're going to use the power of the bee rabbit to do that, because, well, we know the bee rabbit was basically constructed to destroy chains of varying sorts. And so the whole idea being that she figures that the bee rabbit can basically take away parts of her memory. Well, essentially, I guess what they do is they possess Alice's dead body, or maybe the body still is not quite dead or she's dying. And so this whole conversation has kind of taken place just before Alice completely breathes her last breath. And so essentially what they do is they are trying to use the link back to her real body to then pass into the bee rabbit. And the intention is going to do it. And then when she sees Jack and Jack calls out to her and has all this happiness and joy and love, it causes her to hesitate and to pause. And this is where black-haired Alice is like, see ya! And she jumps into the bee rabbit and kind of possesses Oz in a sense. And so she goes to destroy the memories of the intention of the abyss. And of course, the core of the abyss is like, I won't let you hurt her. Everything goes haywire. It gets all messed up. And essentially what ends up happening, and that kind of plays into what we end up finding out about Jack and his ultimate fate, is that, as far as I can tell, between the bee rabbit's powers and the interference from the core of the abyss, it causes basically this explosion, if you will. And you've got the core sort of repelling, causing this energy of sort of repelling against the bee rabbit. We have the bee rabbit interfering with that. And Jack gets caught in the middle of it. And what ends up happening then is that the intention's memories aren't truly purged or destroyed. They're merely scattered. And that's why we find that they're still in existence. And what's kind of key to this whole thing is that the memories that Alice, black-haired Alice, has been chasing for all this time aren't even her own memories. They are the intention's memories. For Alice, her memories have only been basically suppressed because of her interaction with the bee rabbit. And because of this, cataclysmic melding of energies as she tried to attack the intention. And Jack, being caught in all of this, has his own, basically, soul, almost, like to the level of his soul, gets shredded, essentially. And parts of him are cast aside. And as far as we kind of find out, it sounds like part of him is tied to those shattered memories of the intention. And so Jack, both physically and spiritually, is rejected by the abyss. Now, we know from what Glenn has been talking about, the abyss is basically like, it's almost like heaven. I mean, it's not so much that souls reside there, but it seems to be heaven's probably not the right word for it. Purgatory would probably be better, if you're going to use Christian analogy, purgatory would probably be a better word. It's basically the pathway that souls take where they are then guided from their previous life into that 100-year cycle and then returned back to Earth. So the abyss is kind of like a passageway for souls. Now, when the abyss rejects you, like it does with Jack, like he gets mixed up in this, basically what ends up happening is Jack gets into a cycle of reverting back to childhood, to infancy, and then growing once again back to his adult age, and then again reverting back, and so forth. Now the body is having this. It's sort of like it looks to me like it's kind of like a side effect. I mean, Glenn, well, Leo/Glenn, we'll call him Leo Glenn. Leo Glenn basically says to Barma that this is the abyss completely rejecting Jack. And I mean, I get where he's coming from, but on the flip side, I don't even know if it's really that. Like, it almost seems like just a side effect. Like, it to me, it's that idea where because the abyss itself is all about time, right? Like, the abyss is the beginning and the end. Even Leo Glenn says that. So to me, basically what it is it's kind of like captured the end of Jack's life. And now it then returns him to the beginning, and then returns him to the end, and then returns him to the beginning. He's become basically caught in the same loop that the abyss is perpetually in the existence of. So in a way, to me, it's almost like Jack now physically is embodying the abyss and how the abyss exists. Even though the abyss doesn't necessarily, grow young again, it just perpetually exists through all of existence. Now, the issue of this, of course, is that Jack, even though there's a part of him that resides in the body, a part of his soul, basically Glenn says, like, that's great and all, but the soul can't handle that. Like, that's not how souls are meant to be. And that basically this forcing the body to work backwards and then forwards again and backwards again, every time this is happening is basically putting strain and burning out the soul because it's operating in a way that it's not meant to function. And so that bit of Jack Vesalius, every single time that he goes back and forward and everything, just begins to disappear more and more. And in the end, the child that ends up arriving at Jack Vesalius's doorstep as an infant is in fact no longer living because of the soul of Jack Vesalius. It now exists because of the soul of Oz, the soul of the bee rabbit, which has basically become trapped in the body because it was separated, forced out by black-haired Alice. Now, this whole thing gets kind of like, I had to read this a couple times to kind of put it together for myself. So it seems to me like all of this is about displacement and things sort of going haywire. And we see that the chaos of the abyss is now being mirrored basically in all of these characters that we have, right? So for me, basically what black-haired Alice, what Alice did was she forced her way into the physical existence of the bee rabbit. But by doing so, because the bee rabbit was tied, was contracted with Jack, basically she kind of pushed Oz out, and he becomes sort of a subservient soul, if you will, to Jack. Now, we're seeing the same sort of thing happening with Leo, right? Leo has had this sort of existence of Glenn in the back of his mind or what have you for his whole life. And now it's starting to come forward as the seals are being broken until finally now the final seal in this volume is broken and Glenn completely comes to the forefront and is like, yeah, that Leo kid, not coming forward. He won't fight anymore. He's no good to us. Yeah, don't expect to see him again. And in a lot of ways, we're seeing this same sort of thing happen with Oz, right? We have the existence of the bee rabbit inside this body, and we have what's left of Jack Vesalius. And when he joins Zai as part of Zai's family as an infant, at this point, Jack Vesalius, that component of him, has burned itself out. And the soul that is causing this body to live and breathe is the soul of the bee rabbit, the essence of the bee rabbit. And this, to me, evokes kind of an interesting question because we know from the previous volume that the creature known as Oz, the chain bee rabbit, that essentially it was an inanimate object that was subjected to the energies of the abyss at the core of the abyss and then became sort of a living sentient consciousness because of that. Now, I don't get the impression that really that existence is informing what Oz is doing right now. To me, this Oz that we know now is a product of his upbringing. He's a product of the people that he has interacted with and everything else. The fact that he's the bee rabbit, the fact that that soul, if you will, or that essence of the bee rabbit is what causes his body to function, seems kind of irrelevant. I mean, yes, obviously it gives him the powers of the bee rabbit. Yes, there's a whole bunch of other complicated crap associated with that. But when it boils down to it, the personality of Oz, Vesalius, has essentially been created by his experiences in this current lifetime. Now, to me, I think that's an important distinction, right? Because and it does become important, I think, later on how it sort of plays out. Now, for Oz, he's basically given up. Like he thinks, I've stolen this body from Jack. This isn't even really mine. But does it really matter to me? Like I kind of think of it like a house. I mean, whoever owned the house, if they sell it off to you, it's your house. It doesn't matter who owned it first. They left, you moved in, fair is fair, right? And I'm guessing that basically what's happened now is that Jack burned himself out and that in this existence now, because, and okay, so this is where I find this really interesting. And this is where it's kind of funny. And this is where we get into this whole cause and effect and everything else. So the Baskervilles drop Oz into the abyss because they say that he is a danger because he can be used and manipulated to control the intention. And it is because of Jack Vesalius, right? But here's the thing. From what I can tell, Jack Vesalius is gone. He doesn't exist in Oz at that point. And it isn't until Oz interacts with Alice the Bee Rabbit in the Abyss, which, when he forms the contract with her, it's kind of like, this is where I was saying, you know, in the previous one, like, how does Alice exist? And we saw in this one where Oz, when he denies Alice's existence, she disappears and returns to the Abyss. And so to me, this is basically what I was saying before, right? She was tied to the Bee Rabbit. When the Bee Rabbit's abilities and powers returned to Oz, to its own essence, the only thing that kept her around was basically Oz saying, I acknowledge that you exist. It was basically him using, whether he knew it or not, it was basically him using his abilities as a chain to create a manifestation and to give her sort of an existence, a physical existence, because otherwise she is just a spirit. And the second that he denies her and says, no, I don't accept you anymore, she of course returns to the abyss, and that's where she has all of this other stuff revealed to her. So then, of course, you know, they interact, they come out of the abyss, they're saved from the abyss, and I'm wondering, like, I have to say that we were told that basically Jack's soul was splintered along with the memories of the intention. And so their very first memory that they find of Alice with Jack, like in that garden, and then of course later with Cheshire and the interactions that they have there, these are all the things that have now allowed Jack Vesalius to start to take root again in his own body. None of this would have happened if they had just left Oz alone. At least this is what I get the impression, right? That basically Jack Vesalius, the existence that was Jack Vesalius, had burned itself out in that body. It was gone. And the only reason that it now is there is because he interacted with Alice. And the only reason that happened was because they threw him in the abyss. And now they've gone and sought out her memories, which weren't even her memories to begin with. And that's what's given Jack the foothold to return to this body, use the abilities, and of course, shatter the world's chains. Or at least weaken them to the point where now there's a threat that this could all go. And again, this is a really funny thing, right? Like, this is, you see this play out again and again in fiction, this whole idea of, you made your own problem. like your problem really didn't exist. If you had just sat back and let things ride out for a little bit longer, it would have been fine. But the fact that you interfered because of your fear and because of your doubt is what's caused you now to screw everything up. And when we see the whole thing with Oz and that Jack Vesalius is gone, this child, this infant, has now grown up basically as a blank slate. Yeah, okay, the Bee Rabbit, the essence is what gives him life. But in terms of his personality, in terms of the person who he is, he truly could have been Oz Vesalius. He is Oz Vesalius. And I mean, Zai, if he had given him that love and affection, I mean, this child truly could have been his son, the son that supposedly he lost. And that's another thing that I kind of wonder about, is that Jack shows up on his doorstep and is like, yeah, your baby's going to die. And I'm like, how do you know that? Like, have you caused that to happen? Or do you just know that because it seems to be a cycle thing? Like, who was it that took care of Jack? Because, I mean, he's probably gone through this at least, what, 2 or 3, maybe 2 times by the point we get to Oz. Like, you figure Jack is, what, 21? Is like, he's probably about 20, 22, something like that. So, I mean, from the point of the abyss closing off, he would go back 22 years, then would age again 22, that's 44. Then would go back, that would be about, we're pushing the 75. And then, of course, Oz being about 15, dropped in the abyss for 10. Yeah. So Jack's only done this maybe 2 times. And so, I mean, at this point, we have to wonder, like, who took care of him beforehand? Is this sort of like a Vesalius house curse that I'm kind of curious about. And I don't know if it'll be addressed, but I am kind of curious about that, like how he knew that Zai's child was going to die and who it is that's sort of, raised him from infancy beforehand. That I'm curious to find out and see sort of how that plays out. And of course, we find out now, of course, it's worth noting that Jack, of course, has basically set all of this up. I mean, this is something that I talked about, I think, in the last video about how did Jack have anything to do with the forming of Pandora? Well, yeah, we do find out that he did. And that essentially he was the one who handpicked the dukes who would be sort of the 4 great dukedoms. And that Rainsworths were basically just in it to validate the whole thing because they were from an aristocratic bloodline. We find out basically that Duke Barma helped Jack forge all of this stuff to save his family's reputation because he knew that Miranda would be implicated in the whole thing and that would cause their whole house to be crushed. And so it's this whole thing where, yeah, he becomes complicit in order to try and save the family. And of course, the current Duke Barma, I mean, the irony of it all is that the strain and stress and kind of horror of it all ends up ending the former Duke Barma's life prematurely. And what did he gain out of it? Nothing from what I can see. But I mean, I guess the family continued on. But we kind of have a better idea now why the current Duke Barma has sided with the Baskervilles the way he has, because we basically are finding out that the Baskervilles were never the villains in this whole thing. Regardless of how they've been set up for this whole series, essentially the Baskervilles are not the villains. They are essentially the ones who are trying to right the world, that are trying to save the world, and that it's the dukedoms, if anything, well, particularly Jack Vesalius, that has screwed everybody over and caused all of this. And so you can kind of sort of see where Duke Barma at this point is kind of like, it's not just a matter of joining the winning side. This is also him kind of trying to right the wrongs of his ancestor. One thing I also wanted to point out, and I mean, I know I'm kind of flipping all over the place, but I've got so many ideas about this volume and so much stuff was revealed in it that just made me question everything. But I want to say right now that while I think about it, I really appreciate the fact that, again, Mochizuki avoids melodrama. The whole thing about Gil shooting Oz at the end of the previous volume is handled so clean and quick in this. Oz is like, oh, he's Glenn's valet. Everything is as it should be. Of course he would shoot me. And I really appreciate that. Like, so too often in all forms of fiction, whether it be novels, manga, TV, what have you, they would have milked this thing for a while. And now I don't know if it's because we seem to be coming really close to the climax that she didn't want to dwell on that, or whether that's just she's just a better writer than to fall into that all too often cliche trap. But I really appreciated the fact that she was just like, yep, Oz gets it. Boom. No hard feelings. That's how it is. And we see the angst, of course, in Gil because of this. And Gil decides to act on it. You gotta love Gil to a certain extent. I mean, you have to pity him and feel sorry for him. But at the same time, you just gotta love that guy. Like, he basically goes out and he says, I have an oath branded on my left hand that means I must obey Glenn. I don't want to, so I don't need it. And he uses Raven to blow his own arm off. Now, I don't know if that means that he's now lost Raven, like, because he says he received it through his left hand. So I don't know if that means Raven is gone from Gil, and I don't even know if it really matters. But I do enjoy the fact that, Gil is a man of action in a way. Like, Gil has made his decision, and this is where I was talking about this whole thing about the person that Oz is more important than his origin. Because at this point, of course, Gil doesn't care. Like, Gil doesn't care that who Jack Vesalius was. He doesn't care about that kind of stuff. What he realizes is that this boy Oz is important to him and that he wants to protect Oz. It doesn't matter how he started or, what he may have been in the past. None of that matters. What matters is the person who's in front of him and the person who was his best friend and master for those years that he most recently remembers. And so he chooses to destroy the thing that causes him to obey Glenn and to stand with Oz and protect him. And of course, we have Glenn saying that not only was he going to kill Oz, but we have him saying that he's going to go back in time and he's going to kill Lacey. So that way Jack never meets Lacey and all of this stuff never happens. There's no B-Rabbit, there's no nothing. Now, immediately Oz is like, how do you do that? And he's like, well, I'm going to eliminate everybody who stands in my way. But, I mean, we have to remember that the whole thing is that the abyss stands as sort of an out-of-time thing. And that essentially you can enter a door at one point in time and exit a door at another point of time. So far, all we've seen happen in this series so far is people moving forward. So they enter in a door and then come out a door 100 years later because things get messed up, even though it doesn't seem like it was that long for them. There's nothing saying that it can't go the other way, that you could enter into the abyss in the current day and exit 100 years in the past. And I'm thinking that's obviously what Glenn's idea is. And I'm sure there must be some sort of issue with that or something that makes it difficult, or else you would think that some Glenn previously would have been tempted to monkey with the system that way. But obviously I mean, theoretically it would be doable, right? If you have the abilities of Glenn to travel the abyss in a way that virtually no other person can, then yeah, I mean, technically you would be able to, right? The only thing that I kind of think is going to be interesting in this is that Vincent, being a child of the red eyes, of being the child of ill omen, he can do that stuff too. At least that's what we've been led to believe. So I kind of wonder if this is how things are going to play out, that Vincent is going to side with Gil and Oz and everything else, and that he's going to be the key to either chasing after Glenn to stop him, or like, I don't even know what's going to happen from here. I don't know whether obviously, well, I mean, okay, Glenn could succeed. I was going to say, obviously he doesn't, because that would ruin the story. But I mean, really, tragic endings aren't exactly unknown in manga or anime. So, I mean, it's completely possible that he could win, but I don't think it'll go down without a fight. And I think Vincent maybe will be the key to that. Because the intention, we already know, the intention is not stable. We don't know who the intention will side with. She may not side with any of them. She may seek to destroy them all. Who knows? Now, the other thing that I want to sort of get into this, I guess the last point that I want to address, because of course these videos get longer and longer, but I mean, so much goes on. The other thing that I wanted to address was how it was so interesting that Zai picked this point to show up and discuss this whole thing with Oscar and reveal this whole thing with Oscar and Ada. Now, it's timed in the manga about the same point where the decision is made to execute Oz. And I kind of think that this is that kind of idea where Zai is basically trying to cut off resistance. He's basically trying to make sure that Oscar and Ada, that part of the family, understands that, you know what, you're not saving a boy, you're not saving my son. This kid is a monster, basically. He's basically revealing the whole reality of Oz to try and shock them to the point where they won't feel the need to try and protect Oz. And it's trying to sever that whole familial tie between them. And this is where I think that whole part of the camera thing played in, right? Because we know that Oscar being willing to bring that camera out for the first time ever and use it, that was basically a symbol of him severing the hopes and dreams and past and accepting Oz and Gil and Alice and all of them as his family. And so I think that this whole thing where Zai is trying to convince Oscar, I think, is going to blow up in his face, the same way that Gil, of course, said, hell no, I'm staying with Oz. And again, we have, and like I was saying, the bookend of this, right? Where that same story, that same beginning where Oz is like, when we're adults, you need to call me Oz. And this is where we finally have Gil looking at him and calling him Oz and saying, like, this was the moment. Like, I've waited till we could stand on the same ground where I could call you your name in the way that it should be called. And this is where we end the book. And wow, I mean, again, I am probably missing a ton of stuff. There are so many things going on in this series and so many questions that I still have about sort of the mechanics of this and what went through people's heads, and how is it that Jack Vesalius agreed to take Jack as an infant, but then, like, what made him change his mind, or what made him, you know, turn against the child, or what made him feel like he was forced to take on Jack, but yet clearly didn't want to, and that's why he mistreated him. I don't know. We still don't even know the full story about what happened to Oz's mom. And, you know, whether that's significant. Well, I mean, I guess she isn't technically his mom, or Jack Vesalius' wife. We still don't know what happened to her exactly, whether she truly was just assassinated as part of a plot, or whether Zai did her in for some I mean, Zai could have killed her because maybe she started questioning things. Who knows? But I'm hoping we find out, because it seems to be a bit of a thread that's been left and not really addressed in any way since way back. So we'll see what ends up happening. Anyway, I'm going to end the video here because, again, already getting very, very long, and I'm eager to read volume number 20 and see what happens and make that video. Again, anything that I have missed, or if there's anything that you want to talk about more, please put it into the comments. I will try to organize my thoughts in a more linear fashion next time, because I know I kind of went a few different places in this, but, you know, they just kind of all mishmash in the head as you're sitting here talking. Thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you very much. You know, I haven't really said this, but this is volume number 19. So this is the 19th video that I have done on Pandora Hearts, and I know that some of you have been following these really faithfully, and I just think that's amazing, and I really appreciate it, and I love the conversations that we have about this manga, and I've really, really enjoyed reading it and talking about it with all of you, so thank you so much for that. Please, again, leave your thoughts, comments in the comments section down below, especially if there's something that I missed that you want to address. I will see you in the next video. Until then, bye-bye for now.